Welcome to the first part of the debut episode of the Mendez Movie Report Podcast, covering film news that caught my interest for the week of April 27th, 2026. I'm your host and namesake film critic, Louis A. Mendez. If you want to check out more of my work, you can visit mendezmoviereport.com or find me on all social media, whether it be Letterboxd, X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Reddit, or even award expert in Gold Derby under Mendez Movie RPT. And this is admittedly a big gamble for me, given that I will be going solo, which is the first time of the many times that I've attempted to have some kind of successful podcast venture to go solo. There will be no one for me to bounce off from like I have in past times that I have attempted to have a successful and continuous podcast. And I've been trying to do that for a couple years now, even as the newsletter itself has grown, even as my um, presence online has grown, and I'm very proud of the fact that I am followed on social media by some people that I honestly consider to be the kind of heroes of mine, or folks that I take their professional thoughts on film very very seriously. I have previously tried podcasting ventures in 2020 when my back when I was still doing some sophology work, which I'll get into later on, with my brother Jose Mendez, which some of you are aware of, because he and I have attempted to do podcasts many times. And in 2020, when I was doing stuff on sophology, which is basically based on the study of public opinion and elections, we attempted to do a podcast, and it was a disaster. We had so many errors where we did not know how to do a podcast. We really did not know what we were doing. And quite frankly, my brother was not that interested to begin with. So there was a time where I really just had to cut off attempting to do that podcast. Um, I did try again in 2021 doing a podcast of movies, once again with my brother, who's not the biggest cinephile, but I will give him props that he did really lock in that year to try to do that podcast with me. Unfortunately, it didn't get past a year, because on top of me starting the newsletter, it just was pretty obvious that it was going to take too much to get him to keep doing it. And why have someone involved in a podcast if they're not interested in doing it? In 2024, I tried again covering the Oscars with real consideration. I had a fellow film critic, Dan Skip Allen, who used to be a fellow colleague over for Critics Association of Central Florida. We did that for about a year. Dan and I eventually ended up realizing that we just did not have the same vision on the podcast, on where it was going, on the way we were going to work together, which was a big thing, or how to get guests and such. So that didn't work out. And then again, I tried it again with in 2025 doing movies and gaming. I called it the Real Lounge Podcast. And if you guys, if the two or three of you that even remember me attempting that podcast, we just it was just pretty obvious that it was my grand vision of creating this almost like nightcap atmosphere of trying to do movies and gaming in one was just not going to work out. I mean, my brother just did not have the energy to talk about movies when we were talking about movies. I didn't know much of what I could say when we were talking about games. We kept playing around with all these different things to do with the podcast. It was just clearly not working out. So just thought it was better off to call it quits on that. Quit while you're ahead. Um, and basically, I've decided, you know what, I'm going to try to do something. And I've been thinking about this for a while now. There is a pro wrestling podcaster, Jason Solomon, who has a podcast called Solomon Monster Sounds Off, where he talks about pro wrestling, the last week in news in pro wrestling. And I was really, really interested in the idea of why don't I attempt to do what he's doing, but with film. And so I'm just going to go ahead and give this a shot. And if it fails, it fails. But like I said, I it's a gamble that I want to take a part in. Um, and basically, the idea is going to be to look at the latest film news that caught my attention, and expanding what I've been writing about. And again, film news, movie reviews, Oscar projections, best of lists, all that stuff I want to cover on the podcast. And as you can already tell, the first part to this debut episode is more of an introductory segment for the podcast. And the next part of this debut episode, which should be coming out the day after I um, record that part, will be more like what to expect on a typical episode. So bear with me on this first part here. My journey to being a cinephile and then eventually a film critic really does begin with what was the first ever movie in my life that I can remember seeing. And the answer to that is actually 1975's Terror Mechagodzilla. Back when I was a kid, it was very common for syndicated TV to run a lot of the classic Godzilla films. And I remember, I think I was about 3 or 4 years old at the time, basically sitting in the floor of my grandma's house, watching syndicate, cheap TV, and Terror Godzilla kind of just stuck with me and my brother. It's like kind of cool to see these giant monsters fighting each other, and wow, there's these two Godzilla's gonna have to overcome two villains at the same time. It blew my mind, and because of that, Godzilla has gone on to become my all-time favorite narrative fictional character, and I credit him and the franchise to getting me into movies in the first place. So one thing you're gonna figure out with me, if you've only been listening to the podcast, or you've just been tuning into my work, is that I'm a massive, massive Godzilla fan. I'm always gonna give a lot of Godzilla movies, not all of them, but a lot of Godzilla movies more praise than you're going to see from other critics. Um, those movies are just very special to me. Um, on top of that, what was the first movie that I remember going to the theater for and really making me begin my journey as a theater goer? And that will be actually 1992's Aladdin. It's funny because originally the field trip that we took in my preschool um, was to this big theater that used to be next to the mall, and this was back in Puerto Rico at the local city that I lived in at the time. There were two theaters. There was this small theater that my aunt would drive us to, and then it was like this big theater that had multiple screens on it. And it was next to the mall. And we were actually gonna go see Beauty and the Beast. And I don't understand how there was a mix-up in thinking that Beauty and the Beast was still playing in theaters or what. But we went there and found out that instead we would be watching Aladdin. And it had just come out. And I mean, my mind was blown at how big the screen was. I think if I remember correctly, I actually sat pretty close to the front, and seeing that massive sand tiger come out at the beginning of that movie, I'll never forget looking up at it. Aladdin's also very interesting in that. As everybody knows, that scene towards the end with Jasmine, which that kind of made me realize, I think at a very early age, that I was a pretty much a boring straight guy. But that was followed up by my aunt taking me to see movies as a kid. I saw Lion King thanks to my aunt on the big screen. Um, for some reason, I remember, I think there's a movie called Andre about a little girl and a seal. And for some reason, I distinctly remember her taking us to see that. And it's funny because that movie, obviously it's not gone on to be remembered for anything, but it's kind of like a reminder of these movies you go and see in the theaters, and no one's really going to remember them. You're not even going to think about them that much later in life. But when you have so many movies coming out, that's going to happen. Um, so that was my next part of that journey. And then after that, Um, I after I moved from Puerto Rico to the States, I got used to my parents taking us to the movies. Particularly, I think my dad in particular got really hooked on it because his uncle was a big movie goer. I mean, he was like at the movies like every week, and then I remember we went and saw Toy Story on the big screen. I think that's the first movie that I saw in the theater when I moved here to the States from Puerto Rico, and we also I remember Jumanji, which was massive when it came out. I remember seeing The Lost World. I remember that um, in theaters. And then after that, there was of course the part of that as I grew older, watching Godzilla movies. I got into the Universal monsters, and the big thing though that I think kind of made me go into a journey where I think I appreciated certain film past just whatever IP stuff was gaining attention at the box office, especially for a lot of kids my age, was that I did grow up on Turner Classic Movies. I grew up on the late great Robert Osborne, introducing me to movies, getting to see classics, getting to discover new favorites by doing that. Um, and before I before 2020, I wrote about psephology, and I eventually started to lose interest in that because politics was going down a road that I was not very comfortable with, and it's only gotten as quite frankly, in some ways, it's gotten worse than I thought it was going. And I really started to have this like I I had this shift in my consciousness that I my interest in wanting to write about elections and public opinion had completely fallen apart. And it's not to say that I don't still have a little bit of an interest on the subject. I could talk for hours about public opinion, elections, past U.S. elections, which I study like crazy. UK elections, I'm a big. I mean, I can binge UK election nights that are up on YouTube because I find their method of elections so fascinating. But actually writing about it, that's I started to lose its luster for me. Not to say that I don't still opine on it. If you see me on social media, I definitely opine on it. I actually played around a little with getting back into writing about psephology in 2024, but um, the election results kind of made me remember about why I left writing about that in the first place. Um, but I was still, I was still a cinephile. I was watching a lot of movies. I was going to the theater as many times as I could. I was following the Oscars and watching the Oscars, while my brother had kind of shifted to wanting to just play video games. And because of that, I started getting more and more interest in like, you know, what if I try to be, do the film criticism thing? What if I try to catch even more movies than I've been catching? What if I try to like study that more in the history of film beyond just what I've learned from Turner Classic Movies? And really, it kind of started a little bit in 2019 while I was still writing about psephology because I would do these like graphics I would post on social media about reviews I did for movies. And I think I saw like 60 plus movies in 2019 compared to the like 40 plus that I usually did from year to year. And then in 2020, I took it to a whole other level when I decided I'm actually going to try to do some writing on this, do some, do some movie reviews. And I at first I just started by doing just letterbox stuff. A lot of letterbox stuff that quite frankly isn't even around on my letterbox anymore because it's been deleted since. Just and that was an interesting lesson for me because of the pandemic hitting in 2020. A lot of big theaters shut off, a lot of big movies were delayed, and I really had to lean into like instead of waiting for Oscar season to know what are the auteur films to watch, you're gonna have to watch all these movies that come out each weekend and make up your mind and then see what gets into the Oscar race. But since then, in 2021, I tried doing reviews via podcast with my brother. Did that for a year. Enjoyed it. I to this day wonder what it been like if we had kept it up. But there's also a lot of things that I'm glad that didn't last at times, because I had certain views on movies and debates around audience scores and critic scores that are different now that I've actually become a film critic and I've gone to screenings and I've seen what it actually takes to be a film critic, and d- more nuanced conversations around that kind of stuff. And um, on top of that, my brother, he's not a big cinephile, and it was getting to be tough to get him to lock in with that. So I decided, you know what? I don't want to. I want to put the man through any more torture, or put me through paying for a lot of gas to go see, so that to make sure that we both went and saw a movie that weekend. Because I have a local theater right next to me, and I decided I'm going to start a newsletter, and I'm going to call it the Mendez Movie Report. And since 2022, I've been doing that newsletter. And before you know it, I was joining critics groups. I joined the Critics Association of Central Florida. I joined the Puerto Rico Critics Association, and I recently joined the International Film Society Critics. And I do have a goal that hopefully one day I'll be a member of Critics' Choice. But hey, let's not jump the gun here. Let's see. Let's take it little by little. Um, but I've been very happy with the way that that's happened. That my growth has been as a film critic. It's I've when you're in a situation where you're getting followed on social media by folks who write for the trades and only follow so many people on social media. I'm not talking about folks who just follow whoever follows them back. It does kind of make you start realizing to be a little bit more. um I feel like I got to be a little bit smarter in what I write, because or what I advocate when it comes to film criticism award season, because it means that they kind of are interested at the very least at what I have to say for them to follow me for back as a critic. So that has been my journey, and now what I want to do is I want to try doing some weekly film news coverage on top of the film criticism that I've been doing. And I think this podcast should hopefully help me out with that, on top of some weekly digests that I will be doing. Recently I basically put myself through a self-imposed paternity leave because of the recent birth of my newborn daughter, and that led to basically about 2 months of no new content coming from me over at my newsletter over at mendezmoviereport.com. It had been going on almost 2 months, and I'm very excited about the fact that over the last week, as I record this, I've been kind of getting my feet wet again, and I've already got a lot of stuff that I've been doing, including these weekly digests where I'll be covering the latest film news over the week that have caught my attention, and really is going to guide what I want to talk about in this podcast on a weekly basis. And it's interesting because if you would have told me a year ago, and I'm just going to talk some personal stuff here for a quick second. If you would have told me a year ago that I would be a dad, I would have told you you're either nuts, or I'm not aware of a bunch of relationship drama that's going to happen where I'm not going to be married anymore and I've somehow knocked some poor girl up or something like that. Because this, I've, I'm 37. A year ago, obviously, I was 36. And even though I do not feel 36, 37 at all. I honestly feel more like 26, 27 mentally. I feel that way. And I think that's a lot of that has to do with the fact that both sides of my family have genetics where we tend to live a long time. Um, and when you get to that age, and your wife is about that age as well, and we've gone through a lot of issues ourselves. I was very public in my newsletter about the fact that in 2023 I was going through a trial separation, which ended up lasting a little over a year. And you know you get to a point where you start thinking that maybe it's just not meant to be. We never could get pregnant. We were starting some fertility stuff, and that kind of fell apart after the doctor that we had ended up not being a good fit for us. Um, and then, of course, life happens, and we just didn't think it was going to happen, and then magically ended up happening. Fun little fact: I learned that we figured out afterwards, but basically my wife was unknowingly pregnant when we went to a Metallica concert last year. So I guess technically my daughter can say that she's been at a Metallica concert. And that's the number one thing that I would say to someone if they told me a year ago that I'd be a dad. The number two thing would be finding out that I'm gonna be a girl dad, which is interesting because I've never in my life has seen myself as a girl dad. And consider that it is very likely this will be my only child, it's gonna be interesting because I've never seen myself as a girl dad. And I think subconsciously, because I didn't want to think about all of the things that come with having to raise a girl compared to a fellow guy. And what I mean by that is that there are things that you got to be careful for as a guy growing up. You have to be careful for the fact that we get ourselves into doing a lot of stupid crap that gets us physically hurt. One of the big reasons that men don't live as long as women is because men are doing stupid stuff when they're young, getting themselves killed, and does that drives down the average for men. And you know, on top of that, there's things that guys have to worry about. There's the whole toxic masculinity of it all. There's what all these pressures of what is it to be a man. There's constantly having to be the one who's doing the chasing and the wooing when it comes to dating and relationships, and that creates I honestly think that has been a big part of the major problem that we've been having with a lot of young men getting turned into more attracted to a lot of sort of aggressively right wing centric misogynistic content. Is that this pressure on men to have to be the ones to be doing the chasing and such. And it's not to say that growing up a guy there aren't things that you have to learn and worry about, but the fact is that women do have to deal with much more things than us men do in terms of safety. There is a reason that those women in those interviews said that they would prefer the man over the bear. Even though there's a whole other nuanced conversation I have about that kind of stuff, but this isn't that podcast for that. Um, there's, women are bigger victims of violence than men are. Um, it's there's a lot of these double standards and unfairness um that my daughter's gonna have to deal with. And I think that was maybe the subconscious part of me. And that's really good takes me to my next part about what it's like to becoming a dad. And a lot of people keep asking, like, how do you feel different in any way about becoming that? Because there have been stories of guys that have maybe not been living the best life, or they haven't been making the most moral decisions, or they haven't been the best person, and then all of a sudden a child comes into their life and it's like something clicks in them to start changing something. And so a lot of people have been asking me about that, like, how does it feel? Like, do you feel like a different man? And can't say that I feel like a different man, even though I will say maybe there's going to be some things in the years ahead that's going to hit with me different now that I'm a dad. So, for instance, as I record this, I actually watched Prince of Egypt. I decided to put it on while taking care of the little woman tonight. And I've seen Prince of Egypt plenty of times. It's one of my all-time favorite movies. It's one of my all-time favorite animated films. I'd have to think about it and look at other movies again from that year, but it might be my favorite movie in 1998. Um, and I have never found myself getting emotional over that first scene in which Moses' mom puts him in the, you know, to leave. He basically says goodbye to her son, places him in denial, and hopes that things turn out, and he survives because the king's men are out there trying to. The pharaoh's men are out there trying to kill all the first newborn males, and I actually found myself getting emotional watching that. Um, but I think I haven't really felt a difference in like the way other people have. The thing that I have felt that has hit me though since becoming new dad is how worried I am about my child and how much I fear the idea that I might end up, God forbid, bury my child. It's really like wild how I much fear and worry and responsibility has hit in terms of that. And maybe some people would say that that is should be seen as feeling like different. And it probably also doesn't help that the Facebook algorithm, because sometimes I go through Facebook, they have the Facebook Reels and the Shorts on there, and usually in the past I've gone through there and they have some interesting cosmology videos or funny videos. The algorithm, for whatever reason, and maybe it's because my interest in true crime mixed with them knowing that I have a baby now, has been feeding me off these like depressing videos on children being murdered and babies who didn't who died young, and their parents are now going through their grief by trying to do tribute Facebook posts and stuff like that. And it really just kind of makes you think about the way that this algorithm has really probably driven a lot of people depressed with the way that it does this kind of stuff. um but it's just such an interesting thing in that now I'm constantly obsessed with hoping that she's going to be okay. And it's wild to think that it's probably not going to ever go away until my time on this earth is done. And that, if I had to say anything has made me completely feel different as a dad, as a person, I should say, becoming a new dad, I think that would be it. And that has been a very interesting thing in my first 2 months now since becoming a dad. All right, so let's get, now that we've gotten some introductory stuff out of the way. Uh, I don't want to leave this first part of the debut episode without any actual movie talk. So let's talk about the fact that we are now officially 1/3 into this 2026 movie season. And I have to say that so far, I think it's been a generally middling, weak year for movies. Now, that's not really that big of a deal to me because it's literally just 4 months in. I mean, I have seen some folks who have argued that they think it's been an incredibly great start to the year in movies. And I mean, you know, uh, every opinion when it comes to movies is subjective, which is something I'm definitely going to be talking about more in depth in part 2 of this debut episode. But personally, I have felt that has been a weak start to the year so far. A lot of event films have not worked for me. A lot of, you know, there's been a lot of movies I've thought have been good, not great. But again, this is just 4 months in, and this is the way it usually is 4 months in. It's not like, it's a, even in the years where you can pick, oh, 4 months in, there was this movie that completely blew my mind and stuff like that. There's probably a lot of movies out that I was underwhelmed by as well 4 months in. Unfortunately, the fact is that even with the change in not all awards movies being always late films, most of the movies that are probably going to make end up being the best of the year, we're going to have to wait towards the end of the year to get to. um but that being said, um it is there have been 4 months into movies, and I thought, why not have a kind of conversation real quick on the last 4 months in film. And let's start things off with January. In January, we did get a sequel to the pleasant surprise hit of 2020, Greenland. We did get Greenland to Migration. And like many critics, I do have to say that I was underwhelmed by this one. The first movie was okay. I think there were others who gave it better scores than I think it deserved personally, but this one definitely was not in that realm of okay for me. I found this movie to be really a step down in a completely unneeded film, which is unfortunate, but clearly they were trying to get some kind of you know, continue the momentum from the 2020 film, but unfortunately, it was not there, and the movie was not as good. There was, of course, the big Netflix sensation, People We Meet on Vacation. Personally, I found it to be not that indistinguishable compared to a lot of other straight to streaming romances, but that was a movie that there were a lot of other people liked. We did get The Rip, which was we got to see Ben Affleck and Matt Damon together in that. Definitely a dad movie. Definitely a movie that probably got better scores because of the fact that critics got to see as a straight streamer. I do wonder how they would have responded to it if it was a big theater movie where they had to get up off their seats and go see it. But I thought it was an okay movie. There was, of course, Mercy with Chris Pratt. And, it's funny. Apparently, there's a story out there that Chris Pratt took it really, really hard. Um, the fact that this movie completely bombed at the box office. And look, I will say that there are parts of this movie that I was kind of like looking around, like, I think I'm gonna like this a lot more than other people did. But the problem is that as the movie goes on, it does start to trip over itself. It has an intriguing premise, with the whole AI thing, especially given what we're going through now. But it kind of it has these interesting things to say about AI and then throws it in the trash by kind of becoming low key pro AI propaganda by the time we get to the credits. Um, yeah, I was not a fan of that movie. We had Return to Silent Hill, which I think was a complete and utter disaster. I think it's the kind of movie that I think you can mock Mystery Science Theater 3000 style for a while. That would have been my pick for the worst film of the year so far. We did get Sam Raimi's Send Help, and there were a lot of people out there who were big fans of this movie. Um, I personally was not among them. I did initially give this movie a C minus grade. I've kind of bumped that up to a C plus. I- Look, it's an interesting premise. I just personally was not as big a fan of the execution as a lot of other people were. We did get the Wrecking Crew, which came out straight to Amazon. Honestly, a better movie than I thought we were gonna get. I personally found it to be pretty freaking enjoyable. But of course, the biggest thing to come out of 2020, out of January for 2026, was 28 years later, The Bone Temple, which is a follow up, a direct follow up to 28 years later, which was one of my one of the films that got an A minus grade from me last year. 4 stars on Letterbox. Um, but didn't quite make it into my personal best of the year list. But that's just because there were other movies that were much that I liked more. Um, and this really was the highlight of January for me. It was another 4 star film as far as I was concerned. I really, really dug the way that it continues to lean into this sort of like philosophical survival horror. The 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 villain in this movie was incredible. Um, Played by the same guy who was in Sinners, which it probably makes me a bad film critic, but his name is completely escaping me at the moment. And Ralph Fiennes has an incredible scene in it, which is still the best scene of the year, if you ask me, especially as a guy who listens to metal. That is without a shadow of doubt the big highlight of January. And for a time, it was for my favorite movie of the year so far. Definitely after we got done with the Oscar season. But yeah, January, I did not see that many great films, but 28 years later, The Bone Temple stood out. When it comes to the month of February, we did get Crime 101, which I thought was a pleasant surprise, especially considering what a pretty negative response to its first trailer. Um, I actually dug the first trailer, but this definitely feels like lesser heat, but the movie gets away with it because I do think it was pretty entertaining. It's a dad flick, but it also sort of has this, I'm not gonna say a tour style to it, but there's this class to the movie that makes it more than just a dad flick. And I did find this to be pretty freaking enjoyable. We did get the animated film Goat, which it was okay. I do think that it kind of at times extended certain stories and scenes and arcs longer than it needed to. The movie I think overstayed its welcome a little bit, but for the most part it was okay. It didn't end up being the anything as bad as some folks thought it could be. We did get a new Gore Versinski in Good Luck, Have Fun, Don't Die with Sam Rockwell in it. I have to say, this is just like with Send Help in January. I did not dig this as much as other of my colleagues did. I think the ending in particular makes the whole movie feel like it was a waste of time. And ultimately, it was a film that I found to be pretty mediocre. So I was not uh, on the bandwagon for this one. There was, of course, Wuthering Heights, which ended up getting very divisive critical reviews, very divisive audience scores. This is from Emerald Fennell, who, I was personally kind of middling on Promising Young Woman. It was a movie that I respected at best more than loved, like other people did back in 2020. It was easily my least favorite of the 2020 Best Picture nominees, even though, again, I didn't outright dislike it. But Saltburn ended up being one of my favorite films of 2023, to the point that Emerald Fennell was actually on my ballot that year for director over Celine Song and Justine Trier, like there were for a lot of other people. Um, I was a big fan and champion of Saltburn. It was like a really dark, twisted version of My Man Godfrey in a way. Um, I When it comes to Wuthering Heights, I liked Wuthering Heights. I thought I enjoyed it for the most part. It does. There have definitely been much better adaptations of this movie done before. Um, this is not a movie that I think is going to be making my best of the year list. It'll probably make my personal ballot for some of its artistry. Um, but for what I thought it was a pretty enjoyable film. You got what you came for, what you would think an Emerald Fennell adaptation of Wuthering Heights would be. Um, and then there was How to Make a Killing, which I don't know why it didn't hit me until after I saw the movie. That this is basically a remake of Kind Hearts and Coronets, which is a British classic film. Though this one does some things different, including having a much more cynical ending compared to that movie. And I was really liking this movie, and then it started to lose me the more it went along. And even though there were some things that I kind of laughed at and kind of chuckled from, I it just ultimately kind of lost me and kind of ended up being more mediocre on my for me on my end. We did also get in February Nirvana the band to show the movie. I've never have seen the Nirvana, the band, the show, but hey, I saw this movie and I had a lot. I found this to be pretty enjoyable. I didn't find it to be as enjoyable as others have. This movie is actually in competition for the best audience scores of the year. I'm not going to go that far. I did not like. I didn't adore this movie like others did, but I had a lot. I had a pretty good amount of fun with it. I found it to be pretty enjoyable. And then of course we also did get Scream 7, and Scream, it's interesting with Scream 7 because there was a situation that people, I knew people who boycotted this movie because of the whole Melissa Barrera, Jenna Ortega situation, um, where because of their views, particularly Melissa's views on the Palestine Israel situation, she got basically kicked out of the series. Now, at first, when they came out with that news, they made it sound like she had said things about that she was like a Holocaust denier and all this stuff, which is bullshit. It was about she had views that are in line with a lot of lefty views on the situation of Israel and Palestine, and particularly with where we are, a couple years later since that began. I think it's only aged better for Melissa to take a stand on that. And because of that, I know a lot of people who straight up boycotted this movie. Um, and then, of course, there was the whole debate of, given that situation, are critics bringing their politics and their frustrations about that going into this movie? And a lot of Scream fans have been arguing that this movie was actually really beloved by audiences. I would argue that while the audience scores were definitely better than the critical scores, they weren't that amazing either. So I think even some Scream fans were underwhelmed by this movie. I was not was not a big fan of Scream 5 and 6. In fact, if you go back to the and read my newsletter reviews for those movies, I think I barely gave both B minus, and in time I've kind of just admitted myself that I don't like those movies. It's really screwed up what happened to the way that they completely butchered, no pun intended, butchered what they were trying to set up in with those Scream 5 and 6. But I did not, I just never got into those characters. I thought there was some really lazy writing, and and in particular, Scream 5 just got way too meta for me. Um, and that's a shame because the first Scream is one of the best films in 1996. I personally like Scream 2 and even Scream 3. And yes, I'm a big defender of Scream 4. But I was not a big fan of 5 and 6. They have not aged well for me. And sadly, I was not a fan of 7. 7 ended up being a very lazily written movie with I mean, with some really questionable storytelling decisions, and mainly among them, probably one of the worst ghost face reveals out there, if not the worst face reveal out there. And I just found this to be an incredibly mediocre film. So February ended up being, not it didn't blow me away when it came to movies, but there was some enjoyable stuff in the middle of all the other stuff that didn't work for me. And as for my birth month of March, we did get Pixar's latest film in Hoppers. And, I was a big, big champion of last year's Elio. In fact, it was one of my top 20 favorite films of that year. And Hoppers for me was not as good as Elio. But, it's interesting because this movie had marketing that did not work for me at all. Um, it's a movie that definitely is made more for kids than adults. Like it really, really leans into the goofiness and the kid jokes a lot. There's a lot of like loud, you know, fast moving scenes happening throughout and arcs and crazy stuff that happens. The villain kind of just comes out of nowhere, and then there's a twist with the villain and all this other stuff. I was actually surprised to find out that Meryl Streep voiced one of these characters. It took me like almost 2 months after I saw the movie to find that out. Um, you know, and yet somehow because the jokes worked for the most part, and there was this warmth and heart to the movie, I did end up finding this enjoyable. Again, this isn't going to end up being one of my favorite films of the year. Um, but it does have a really good shot to make it as one of the films that will put on my ballot for best animated feature. We also did get The Bride, which was Maggie Gyllenhaal's follow up to The Lost Daughter. Now, I like The Lost Daughter more than other people did, but it was interesting to go from doing this auteur vision to trying to do this big studio sort of universal monster kind of thing going on. And it was interesting the way that the studio had to kind of push it to um to basically not get involved in comparisons to Frankenstein last year from Guillermo del Toro. And unfortunately this movie did bomb really bad at the box office. um I will say I did not despise this movie like a lot of other critics did. um and in fact, I'm aware of a couple critics that actually really, really like this movie and defend it. Um, my thing is this: it gave me a lot of Joker 2 vibes in that it's going for certain swings, and it's so technically well made when it comes to the artistry, and the performance is really trying to get into what they're trying to do, that I can't help but respect it, even though it does have issues with its script. And look, I mean, like, I'm not gonna put this as one of my favorite films of the year at the end of the year or anything like that, but I thought it was okay. I dug the some of the zaniness and wackiness. I actually kind of dug what Jesse Buckley was going for in really having to like do multiple personality thing, which they did not put in the marketing at all. And I thought Christian Bale did pretty well for the most part. We did get the Colin Hoover's adaptation for Reminders of Him. I did not like this. I think it was just way too melodramatic for me. It Colleen Hoover is now owing her film adaptations are now owing 2 with me. I They've just not been my cup of tea. We'll see what happens with Verity, which is more of a thriller than the last 2 things that of her works that have been adapted. Um, and then there was also we actually got 2 sort of eat the rich at you know survival horror type of things with Ready or Not 2 Here I Come and They Will Kill You. And I unlike other people, I actually was not high on Ready or Not back from 2019. um I was not high on Ready or Not 2 Here I Come. It's I've not been able to vibe with these movies. There is sort of this dystopia to these survival horror movies that dystopia isn't typically for me. So that is also a factor. I will say that if you ask me to pick between both of them, I like They Will Kill You a little more. And I sort of dug the interesting um things that it was trying to grapple with, and compared to Ready or Not, especially from looking at it from the side of The Help. But ultimately, I was not the biggest fan of both of those movies. Now, something that was a big pleasant surprise to me was Mike and Nick and Alice, which was a straight to Disney Plus slash Hulu film, in which it took basically a gangster crime film and put a time machine on it. And by the way, we're also going to do some absurdist comedy. And on paper, this should have been a disaster. And what ended up being was actually a pretty enjoyable movie. It's a pretty okay date night, staying at home movie to check out. I mean, when you have a movie that kicks off with Oliver and Company's "Why Should I Worry," I mean, I was like instantly like, okay, I kind of dig what this movie's trying to go for, and it somehow made what should have been a disaster on paper work. There's little things that I can nitpick, and Vince Vaughn during the marketing interviews for this was saying some stupid crap, but I found it to be a very enjoyable movie for the most part. But of course, the biggest release that came out in March is a movie that's currently competing for the best audience scores of the year and is arguably at the moment the movie that would win critics uh best picture race, at least on the critics side. Of course, we'll see what happens because we're only 4 months in, and that's Project Hail Mary, which is the big sci-fi epic with Ryan Gosling. Has to figure out how to save the sun by going to another star, and he ends up finding himself having to work with an alien rock. So it ends up being a buddy movie. And look, I have to join the bandwagon. I love this movie. Now I currently have this movie as an A+ film. I definitely want to rewatch it and see how it marinates with me by the end of the year as to whether I still think it's an A+ film. But it's definitely going to end up being one of my top favorites of the year. Like I think it will be for a lot of other critics. I do currently believe that this is probably going to be a Best Picture contender. It's done great box office. And I think my love for this movie, on top of what I think it's working for a lot of people about the fact that there is this, this buddy sort of movie with between Rocky and Grace, and even though you have to wait a good while for Rocky to come into the picture, I think it's about 45 to 50 minutes. Excuse me with my yawning there, but it takes about 45 to 50 minutes for Rocky to come in for like a 2 hour, 30-minute movie. But it's wild that this movie is not really much of an action movie, even though there is one particular harrowing scene. It's really a survival movie involving science. You're watching science take place, and these two dudes trying to figure out this problem, how they can save their stars, each of them. And on top of that, one of the things that I think has made me really love this movie is something that like that I found from Elio, or I definitely found from Interstellar, in that I find cosmology fascinating, and in particular, the last few months, I've really dug into it. And the thing is that if you really study cosmology and then all of a sudden you start looking to the quantum physics things, you do eventually start to hit sort of this, what I would argue is almost this nihilistic aspect to it that some folks in that field or big, you know, cosmology nerds seem to like almost they almost seem to like embrace. And because you're getting into things about these cosmic horrors that are out there, quasars and black holes and pulsars, and the way that the sun will eventually destroy our planet, and the can human beings actually get to a point where they can go to another star and start over and such like that. And I've never have leaned into that nihilism, and maybe a part of that is that I am an esoteric guy, I am a man of faith. But I think this movie really hits on the idea of fighting for humanity and just not giving up. even when facing the realities of a massive universe and all of these things are up against. It's like just fight for humanity, fight for life, fight for your fellow man or fellow rock in the instance of Rocky. And I think that's why this movie in particular hits me really hard, or hit me really hard watching it. And I mean, when you get when a movie gets you to cry over a rock, that tells you everything you need to know. But yes, just like a lot of people, I absolutely adored Project Hail Mary, which is so far 130 into the year, my favorite film of the year. And then, of course, in the last month of April, we did get the drama, which is, if you pay attention to some people, they would argue that this is the most divisive film of the year. Um, it's interesting because I feel like critics might be more divisive on this than audiences. This movie's actually had pretty decent audience scores. Um, Look, there should be a trigger warning about where this movie takes things, because the whole concept of this movie is that two people are about to get married, Zendaya and Robert Pattinson. Robert Pattinson finds out that Zendaya's character uh, did something, well, or sort of almost did something really horrible, and he starts to question whether he should marry her. And this is all done in sort of this black comedy way. This is not necessarily a drama film. This is meant for laughs, even though it's sort of like awkward and uncomfortable laughs. And there's a lot of things in this movie that I really dug. A lot of these stylistic choices that I had a lot of respect for. Um, and there is a nuanced conversation that needs to be had about what this movie tries to tackle, and whether it does it well, and whether it was right to choose that topic for examining the situation of these two people suddenly finding themselves questioning as their marriage that they're about to have. Initially, I gave this movie a middling grade, barely positive, because there are certain things about this movie that bother me. But the more I've thought about it, I've bumped my grade up a little more. I have it as 3.5 right now on Letterboxd. This is not going to end up being one of my favorite films of the year. I do know some people are big fans of this, to the point that I do think it's going to show up on some critics' best of lists. But it's an interesting movie, I would say, that might be worth your time. But I personally have enjoyed it and respected it more the more I think about it. We also got Faces of Death. Faces of Death is, it's interesting because when I grew up, especially when I got to high school, and there was a whole this thing of like trying to like engage with the realities and horrors of the real world that you don't know of. And when I was in high school, you have to understand this is like a big thing to go online and get access to these dark parts of like human interaction. um and one of the things that did that was these Faces of Death movies and series that came out about how it interspliced real footage of people dying with fake stuff. And what I found this to be a fascinating look into that by using that series and turning it into something. Um, and look at a horror element. And I thought the movie was okay when it was all said and done. It should be coming out to Shudder in due time. But I thought it was okay. I did wish that it lived more up to the hype, considering what they were covering. We did also get You, Me, and Tuscany, which is a basically this is honestly could have been a straight to streamer film, but Universal decided to release it in theaters, and it honestly hasn't done that great at the box office. Um, I was kind of mix the negative on this movie. It did really just could have blended in with any other straight to streamer romance film that is not really that inoffensive, but you really forget about it as soon as the credits roll. We got Lee Cronin's The Mummy this past month, which was sort of his different take on the mummy story. And I have to say that I did kind of appreciate the new sort of subverting the subgenre of mummy films that Lee Cronin went for here. But ultimately, the pacing of the movie's questionable. There's a bizarre situation where there's basically two intros to the movie. The movie doesn't know when to end when we get to the final act. Um, and it's unfortunate because I do think there are glimpses of a much better movie in here. And Mother Mary, we got Mother Mary that came out in April, the new David Lowery film starring Anne Hathaway. Um, these David Lowery films tend to get very divisive responses among critics and audiences. And even if critics love a Lowery film, audiences tend to be divisive on them, like we saw with The Green Knight. This is basically a David Lowery film in execution and in the way it's been received. Um, that being said, I know some critics out there that are calling this like potentially their favorite movie of the year so far. I can see this movie popping up on a couple critics' best of lists at the end of the year. The problem is that the audience scores for this movie have not been good. They have just they have not been great. And I can understand why, because this was another one of those movies that I respected more than liked, which is something that tends to happen with Lowry's movies. And it's unfortunate because I do kind of dig what it's kind of going for in this sort of like, and it's pretty to look at in about this the singer and the relationship that she seems to have with the seamstress. And Anne Hathaway is amazing. She looks amazing and has great acting performance in this. So it's going to be interesting to see what critics try to do with pushing this movie. But again, it is a divisive film in the way that it's been received. Um, I do want to mention, of course, another big April release at the big that came out very beginning of April, and that is the Super Mario Galaxy movie, which got into all of this situation because audiences liked it a lot more than critics, though the audience scores for this movie are way down in comparison to the first movie. This is a movie that critics did not like, and I didn't like it either. Look, there was a bunch of this discourse that came out of this movie not having great reviews, of people saying screw the critics, nobody cares about the critics, they're taking an L because this movie did so well at the box office and it's got positive audience scores for the most part. um and I'm going to have more of a conversation on that in part two of this debut episode, because I'll be covering the Michael movie, which also came out in April, that one. um about this whole critics audience divide, which I honestly think is overhyped as after I started looking at the data. And I'm sorry, I've had people accuse me of saying that I didn't play Mario, and thus I would never be able to appreciate this movie. Look, I'm not really a gamer anymore, but I did grow up playing Mario, and there are critics who gave negative reviews to this movie that they themselves have played plenty of Mario and are probably still, and some of them are still gamers. The big problem with these Mario movies is that there is no real storytelling taking place. It plays to the lowest denominator of its audience. It just goes for cameos and Easter eggs, and there isn't much actual storytelling that they're attempting here, because and they know they can get away with it. This is this movie is basically the definition of jingling keys. in front of a baby, and they're amazed by it. I saw somebody said that the Coco Melon crowd's gonna go nuts for this, and I thought the very same thing. Now, my brother really liked this movie, but honestly, I think he and other people just kind of walked in already ready to love this movie. But people would accuse me of doing that with Godzilla movies, and certain people would say that about with me in the Wicked for Good last year. I really want a Mario movie that has actual storytelling and arcs and proper character arcs, because this movie actually tries to hint at something interesting with Bowser and then throws it in the trash. Um, but unfortunately, the movie's making so much money that I don't think Illumination cares because they can get away with it. But I was not a fan of the Super Mario Galaxy movie, unfortunately. Um, and of course, the big release in April was also a Michael movie, but I will cover that um, in the second part of this debut episode. And that'll do it for this first part of this debut episode of the Mendez Movie Report Podcast. Remember, once again, that if you want to check out more of my work, you can visit mendezmoviereport.com or find me on all social media, whether it be Letterboxd, X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Reddit, or even award expert in Gold Derby under Mendez Movie RPT. Until next time, God bless and go watch a great movie for me.